Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. This episode of History of Jackson was sponsored by the Been Around Coffee. Been Around Coffee is based in Peterborough and they sell and make some amazing coffee. You can head to their website to buy some coffee beans or some coffee grounds. Now they make some fantastic coffee and it is my favourite coffee in the country. And for you, want to grab yourself some coffee, head to www.thebeenaround.com and use the discount code HWJ and the Bear 10 for 10% off all your purchases. I'll leave the discount code and the website in the description below. Hello guys, welcome to History of Jackson, the podcast where we bring up-to-date historical research to you guys in an accessible way, presented by past and present media. So today guys, we have Ilise S Carter on the podcast to talk about her brand new book, Red Menace, How Lipstick Changed the Face of American History. And I'm really excited to talk about this book. I found it really fascinating, interesting, and I know you guys are going to love listening to Ilise talk about her brand new book today. So Ilise, thank you for coming on the podcast. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me here. Excited to talk about it with you.
No, I'm really excited as well. And, reading your book, I found it so interesting. And I learned so much history that I didn't know before. But I really wanted to start with a question, what inspired you to write this book?
It's funny. It's a couple of things, but the if I'm being honest, it really almost started on a whim. There still is rather, a publisher, and I always forget their name, and they did single subject books. And so they've done books on like the history of the hoodie, the history of the remote control, very singularly focused books. And I was wondering if anyone had done one on lipstick, and that's probably because I still work as a beauty copywriter. I work in the industry. I've worked as a journalist. And I also am a performer, and when I perform, I dress in a way that what my friend calls being a female impersonator. Like, it's practically drag, but I am assigned female at birth. So it has this whole other layer to it. So I guess I just had lipstick on my brain. So it kind of just started out as a whim. And then once I started researching it, I was like, oh, this is a whole microhistory. There's a lot here. And there really wasn't anything else out there like it. I thought there would be tons, but there are a lot of coffee table books about the history of beauty. There's some stuff about how much people love red lipstick, but there was really nothing there that was like a history where people really went into the library and did the history and what it meant. And I think you very nicely described it earlier as a social history, and that was really very much there. So the more I dug in, the more I'm like, this is a story hasn't been told and I really want to tell.
It's really interesting that you were able to pull elements from your life as a performer and go out on that whim that you had to write a book that you wanted to read.
It wasn't an easy sell. I mean, people are like, well, it's for girls and it's a niche. And I guess it is, but it's also like, well, makeup is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And, it never occurs to me. Actually, if you were going to say it now, you can't, because every male interview I've ever had said, well, I've never worn lipstick. And I'm always like, I don't care. And, that's, if you do, you don't, that's awesome. That's your business. But like, I was talking to someone about it. I was like, well, you never stopped someone who wrote about the Civil War. And it's like, well, I didn't fight in the Civil War. Is this book still for me? Or whatever, name your historical, I wasn't at Waterloo and I've still read about it. So it was kind of getting people interested in it wasn't easy.
Yeah, I can I can certainly imagine that. And I think the book that you've written, people should be interested in it because it is, really fascinating history that delves into loads of different facets of American life. And like you said, it doesn't matter if you wear lipstick or if you don't wear lipstick, or are you involved in the Civil War or not involved in the Civil War. You can still learn about it and be interested in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People ask me for advice. I'm like, what? I am the last person you should ask. In terms of like what color you should wear. A, I don't get a kickback, and B, that's whatever you like is fine by me.
It's a difficult field sometimes, selling history books and then trying to sell history to people.
Yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to look at as well, and we've mentioned this before we've started recording the podcast, what form did early lipstick take? And I know you want to bust a myth with the beginnings of lipstick.
Well, in America, if I have gone into lecture in a room and I said, who do you think is the first lady? Because often that's a good marker of history for Americans, is they'll guess, the first lady, and they're very associated with whatever era they're in. And I say, who do you think is the first lady to wear lipstick? And people will generally say like Eleanor Roosevelt, which puts it at the beginning of the 30s. And the answer is actually Martha Washington, who's our first lady, wife of George Washington. And she had her own recipe for lip color, which was more like it's like a lip balm, but it was it had a red tint to it. And it contained earwax from whales, which obviously you thankfully cannot get anymore. It contained lard. It contained various roots in it to give it color. And it contained raisins and a little sugar. So somebody made a version. I think they substituted beeswax, which you can get for whale earwax. Spermaceti is what that's called. And somebody on the internet, obviously, of course, made it. And it's very greasy and it's pretty gross. In an era of cruelty-free, I highly don't recommend it. But it's much earlier than people think. And we also have this image of it being very low class and very associated with sex workers. And I found that often almost the opposite was true. It was a function of upper class women were wearing it because they had the disposable income and they weren't doing domestic labor or working on farms or anything. It's a highly impractical item. It's if you're plowing fields or lifting kids or doing laundry by hand on the plains of America, it's really not the first thing that comes to mind. And it was either imported or you had to make it, and it was expensive, which meant it was expensive. So I think some of our ideas about it came in later and were sort of backfilled rather than being what actually happened. So it's an interesting history because what was actually happening is not the same thing as what people think was happening. I think it's very formed by pop culture, the way Americans view the Wild West as being very John Wayne, and it really was not like that at all. So I think our perception of it is very fueled by later movies and TV shows and women's magazines that sort of, like I said, backfill story that wasn't actually there. And we came to accept that as the truth.
I certainly wouldn't want to put Martha Washington's recipe on my lips. It didn't sound particularly appealing when you were detailing the ingredients.
I remember when I found it, describing to my best friend who's a vegetarian, and she's like, "That's disgusting." And I'm like, "I know, you hate raisins."
It's also It's also interesting how, we look at, how movies are shaping our horrible historical perception of certain periods, and the role of certain items, in this case lipstick, and their place in society. And it's happened with so many different topics, and it's really interesting that lipstick is one of those. Now, if historical films and media is shaping the way we see lipstick today from the past, what was the reaction of the press, and maybe women's magazines and the women's press, to the emergence of women's beauty products then?
Uh, it's interesting. Women, there's some very interesting, they're varied and some very interesting ones. And I think there was a tendency, and I think there's still a tendency, not that we're completely over this, is to dismiss anything that is sort of interest to women as silly. I was really surprised because it was even before World War One. Some senator was going off on, the government, government offices and statistics puts out how much money we spent on toiletries and cosmetics, and Americans had spent some astronomical sum at the turn of the last century on cosmetics, on rouge and lipstick and powder. And he was already, he's like, silly things that silly women spend money on, but it's also sort of a bulwark against socialism. And I was like, wow, the more things change, the more they stay the same. People still having the same complaints and misunderstandings, and how dismissive they are of it. It's interesting because even very early on, as women start to wear makeup, and they start to wear makeup in a big way, the voice of the beauty press, and I say this as someone who has been a beauty journalist, is very much the same. And it in some ways, and a lot of it is about, this is a skill you must conquer. And I feel like that's another thing I've heard from women, are like, either read the book or, hear me talk about it. And they're like, well, I don't really wear makeup. I never got good at it. And so I think the sort of overwhelming voice is, if you wear it, you must wear it flawlessly. You must know how to apply it. And up until 1917, what changes in 1917 is we get the first, you get the first patent on a lipstick case, like the one that we're sort of familiar with. It's a little different, but it's the general form that we're familiar with. And that makes lipstick suddenly something you can carry in a purse or a pocket, and women are just going out in public more. So they are leaving the house and taking it with them. Before that, lipstick was very much, it was a toiletry item. It was a boudoir item, and you wouldn't brush your teeth at the dinner table, so you wouldn't put on lipstick at the dinner table. And in matter of fact, the writer, oh God, her name just flew right out of my head, and I can see all her books. She wrote The Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton, who is, sort of the, considered the expert on Golden Age, Victorian America. She didn't object to lipstick. She found reapplying lipstick in public to be a filthy habit. She thought it was absolutely foul because it was such a to her, it was such a personal thing. It was like, flossing your teeth or, hiking up your underwear at the table. It just wasn't something that was done in polite society. So the objection at the beginning really isn't to women wearing makeup, but it's supposed to be this big secret. Like, you just roll out of bed looking this way. You don't talk about it. You don't bring it into public. And it's like, there's no way you had an 18-inch waist and, these fluffy skirts and this giant hairdo. Like, you did that, but you did that in the privacy of your bedroom. And so lipstick is like one of those items, like, oh no, I no effort at all. I just rolled out of bed looking like looking like Mae West. And it was the bringing it into public that was the big changeover. And sort of by the time it arrives as an item for public consumption in the 20s, people are okay with it. There's not mostly not a moral objection. I mean, there's always someone who, you'll always find some preacher who's like, you whore. But it's instead sort of more of a, if you're going to wear it, you have to be up on the latest shades and what looks good on you, and you have to apply it perfectly. And there are a million skills that women are supposed to have, like child rearing and cooking and housekeeping. And it's just sort of added to the list of things like, it's just some born in knowledge you have by virtue of being born female, that you know how to handle all of these things. And if you don't, kind of that's what the beauty press is there to help you with. And then later sort of people like Max Factor, like expert, we get this whole expert class. So I think people think the objection was, in the beginning, was moral, like it was unseemly and associated with actresses. That's actually not true. There were a lot of upper class women who had makeup practices that included things like enameling, which was an early, it's exactly what it sounds like. They were painting their skin with enamel. There were these early makeup practices, but it really would have had to have been women of a certain leisure class, because enameling, for example, literally cracked if you moved your face too much. It was kind of proto Botox because it kept you from moving your face, and you couldn't be running around after kids. Someone else was nannying your kids, and you weren't, milking cows or hauling hay or anything of that sort. So, way back in the I think, certainly pre-Civil War, mid 1800s, you hear about society belles using cosmetics to improve their looks. But you really don't, there's no tisk about it in terms of it being a sign that you're loose or too sexy. It's more that, like, it's a well-kept secret, and you should not tip your hand and let people know what you're doing.
And it's really interesting, like you said, to see that some of those attitudes are still prevailing today.
Yeah.
Particularly, in popular media where, they've woken up and they just look like that. Those kind of things, are still prevailing. But you mentioned a couple of really interesting things there that I really want to unpack.
Sure.
Talking after, World War One and the patenting and the invention of the lipstick case.
Yeah.
Those are two really important moments in this history, and that you mentioned in your book, that they start to democratize and revolutionize the cosmetics industry and opportunities for women. Really, would you mind unpacking those kind of ideas there?
It's very interesting because take for something like dating, for example. Dating is a very modern concept. You mainly, people pre-industrial revolution, like, you didn't really date. You were either in an arranged marriage or you met a neighbor or something, like your neighbor had a son your age and you worked it out. And people would come, very Victorian, people would come to the parlor and your family would be there. You was very supervised. But the idea of leaving your house with someone your own age, or and going and having leisure time out in public, is very modern. And after the 20th century in America, you have more people in cities for the first time than in rural areas. And you have a whole immigrant class, and you have the invention of leisure time. You get Coney Island, you get the movies, the Nickelodeon, the dance hall, places people can go and spend their little extra cash and spend their off hours because they work 5-6 days a week. And so that is a newer thing. So, and just women having a place to go. In London, Selfridges is famous because they had some of the first ladies' rooms. And in New York, you can see we have bars. Like there were bars that didn't admit women until the 70s. And you can see that the bathrooms were not at all designed for women. They're like all urinals, and they've installed a couple, probably never had dividers. But so there are a couple of artifact bars like that in New York. But places like Selfridges and in New York on the department stores on Ladies Mile, it was literally just having a place to be in public, more women in the workforce, more women outside the home, and more places that women could go unchaperoned. So just being out in public. And part of that is the invention and adoption of the car. And, people are just more mobile than they've ever been in their lives previous to that in human history. So just going out in the world as women was a newer thing. Lipstick remained there were similar things to the lipstick tube. Like it didn't just blow up in 1917. There were like similar items, but it was messy and it was hard to transport. Often women's clothing didn't have pockets. It would ruin the inside of a purse. But like the invention of that push-up lipstick, that lipstick case where it was contained, was really revolutionary. And women just being out in the world more and going to the movies. The movies were another thing. Like the movies, you get it changes mass media and fame. Suddenly you have famous women who are famous not because they're the wives of presidents or politicians. They are actresses, but they're more available to, vast numbers of Americans rather than like being on Broadway or touring. And you get this class of experts. Like Max Factor is the most notable one. People also knew the Westmore family. But so you suddenly get all these things come together. The lipstick tube, women having disposable income, women being out in public, the movies, all of which come together. Like it was sort of amazing to me how much of the advent of lipstick, just every woman wearing lipstick, was tied in with technology. And even if that technology is just that, it's not AI, it's the tube, although it's now tied into AI. So it was, those changes all came together around the same period. And so you get you just massive, and a sort of baby boom, a sort of mini youth culture boom, which normalizes lipstick and makes it an everyday item and makes it something that's part of your getting dressed and going out in the morning as much as putting on a hat and gloves. And it's part of being seen and it just becomes part of the package of this is what women wear to make themselves presentable.
And it's really interesting that it's emerged this kind of perfect storm, really.
Yeah.
Where opportunities are being made available and now available all at the same period. And it's a very fascinating time in American history, and particularly for American women as well. Now, I want to dive more into the term American women as well, because it's not just white women in America at this point. How does the cosmetic lipstick industry work or not work with African American women and other women from different minority backgrounds? It's
fascinating, and that's a whole other book that I hope someone gets to write, because I don't know that that's my story to tell. But America's first self-made millionaires female, full stop, was not inherited wealth, was a Black woman named Madam C.J. Walker, who actually made her fortune in hair care. And she's fascinating. Her money via her daughter helped bankroll the Harlem Renaissance, and her home is now a historic site. uh Black women were just as interested in beauty. They faced the same pressures that white women did, to be pretty and find husbands and uh you know work outside the home for financial necessity. And then an entire layer of pressures on top of that, which is the standard was, and greatly still remains, although it is getting much better. uh the standard of beauty was white, and the advice that you see in the Black owned papers is very different, and it's about maybe not too much lipstick. You don't want to overemphasize your lips, because that was not considered as attractive as features associated with white women. But obviously they're under the same pressures and the same uh expectations as white women, and then that whole layer on top of it. And there's some very interesting things that happen. The mainstream beauty industry largely does not, for most of its history, does not specifically cater to women of color. It doesn't adjust its color palettes. There are very few foundation shades. So they do develop. There are a number of companies that develop to serve this community very specifically. And one I found really interesting was Lucky Heart Cosmetics. And there were two of them that were similar, and the other one's name, I'm sorry, escapes me right now. And they were founded by Jewish families, or one was founded by two Jewish guys in Chicago. One was founded in Chicago. The other, I think, was in Atlanta or Nashville. And they had a model that was very similar to Avon. You shop from the catalog. They had door-to-door saleswomen. They also had salesmen, which is a little different than Avon. And that was a good workaround, because a lot of the stores were segregated. And so not only was, Revlon, for the most of its history, not thinking about you as a customer, you may not want to go into the Woolworths, because that could be a very uncomfortable experience. So they were, to the trade to the community, and it was a person to person, sort of like an Avon lady, but for women of color. So that was a very good selling model in some ways. It was a way of working around those difficulties. It is an incredibly complicated and fraught history. Cosmopolitan didn't put a Black model on the cover until 1973, and it was Beverly Johnson. It was surprisingly slightly beat by Good Housekeeping. Was like the first major women's magazine, had the first Black model on the cover, but they were largely not represented in ads, unless the ads were in magazines like Jet and other magazines that specifically catered to Black audiences. And same with Latino women, Hispanic women, Asian women. They were largely not seen in the ads. If they were exoticized. I remember opening up an ad that was in the 90s, for Christ's sake, and it was in one of the first issues of Latina magazine. It was called Latina magazine, and it was for Latino women. And they just had Cindy Crawford in kind of what you would think of as a like Latina outfit. Like, they didn't even bother to go out and find a Hispanic woman, a Latina woman to put lipstick on. So it's a very complicated history that reflects our own very fraught history, with just white supremacy, and it is getting better, and I am a great admirer of the Fenty brand, and I'm not even a fan of Rihanna's music. I mean, I don't dislike it, it's not my jam. uh don't come after me. uh uh because she just, as a CEO, she's just like, you know what, we're going to put women of color first and everyone else can fall in behind, and that model has worked. And a lot, a lot of companies have come up that way in the last 10-15 years, and it's great, but it has not been easy finding. Even today, they have a very companies fronted by women, particularly women of color, have uh, a very hard time getting financing, and they're just not sitting on the boards and in product development. And some companies have a really crappy record of the way they treat women of color, become an afterthought, and which is ridiculous, because America is soon going to be a majority minority nation, and they buy lipstick too, and it's not just the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do, but it's also like leaving money on the table. And there have been companies in the last few years that have gotten in trouble for it, like Kylie Jenner's company. They put out nudes, and it was just like, well, okay, but this is nude based on the assumption that everybody is white without their clothing. And that's not what the world looks like. And the world market is just so huge, and so vastly, vastly different. What appeals on one continent or one country is not even the same. East and West are totally different, in terms of, like, what makes an appealing product.
It's
So
fascinating how that industry has reflected America and American values across time as well. For an area of history which people don't typically consider to be reflective,
yeah,
it's incredibly reflective.
it's incredibly reflective, and it's just incredibly American. And I apologize for this. So, we come stomping in with Coca-Cola and Hershey bars and like red lipstick, whether you want it or not, and in some ways. And so uh it's a very interesting, it's another way we do this cultural ambassadorship, and Americans are very insistent on their own way. And in some ways that served them, in some ways that's failed us, but it is this very American insistence, and like on it, in like, this is what beauty looks like. I mean, during World War II, we had one of the things we were sending British women was lipstick, because as in care packages, it's like they were out of underwear, nice nylon underwear and lipstick, and we sent Queen Elizabeth and her sister care packages with American lipsticks in them, because that's, British women were using, they're very resourceful. They were using beet juice and shoe polish and just everything they could think of to substitute for lipstick, because the war effort had sort of killed the cosmetics industry. And that
Well,
was our form of international goodwill.
yeah, it's brilliant that it's even thought of as that icon of goodwill, and something that you would send a princess at that point. Now, there's there's a point there that you're mentioning about the industry dying during these periods, and there's two periods which are incredibly close to one another, where the lipstick cosmetic industry kind of takes a hit, or is affected by the economics of the period or the situation. And you have both the Great Depression in the 20s, and you have World War II. How does the cosmetic lipstick industry react to the Great Depression and World War II, and how do women's attitudes do they change during these periods?
They adapt. Um, uh, and you got to say, in the way the cosmetics industry is, very clever and very nimble. And I was always kind of impressed with the way that they could shuffle around the advertising to meet the moment, and whatever sort of was on top of mind for people, they were right there, like, oh yeah, we hear that too. um so for example, during the Depression, you have the largest number of women entering the workforce, and this is not like, I need a career to be fulfilled. They're like, I need to not starve to death with my family. So you get women in the workforce in the largest numbers ever, and they're taking clerical jobs, and they're, that sort of thing, still very what you might call pink collar work. uh and the women, they turn to women's magazines for advice, and the advice is like, it's all very well and good to be a great typist and to like be smart and to be able to take stenography, but are you pretty when you are going out there? And it becomes such a thing, like, okay, but do you, like, you're competing with a lot of other women, and beauty is currency, and beauty will set you apart. And they're really not, there's some of them that are just out and out, like, well, it's nice that you have a high school diploma, because this was an era when not everybody did. And, like, it's swell that you can type. And it's kind of funny. And that, like, they are very insistent with keeping up on lipstick, and, um, not, there are a lot of jobs that women are working where it's not really possible, being working in laundries and food preparation and all these things, where it's kind of a very unglamorous existence. And they're still like, yes, but are you, really what you want to be when you go into the workforce is pretty and feminist. And that's also kind of a defense against, like, you don't want any guy thinking you're taking his job. And there's an element to it of what I call just consumer porn. Like, uh some of my favorite movies, or one of my favorite movies from the 30s, is The Women, and with Joan Crawford and Rosalind Russell and Claudette, not Claudette Colbert. Anyway, it's just a wonderful film, and the costumes are done by the same designer who designed Dorothy's dress for The Wizard of Oz, the fabulous Adrian, and he just was this consummate designer. And it takes place during the 30s, but there's sort of no hint of the Depression outside. That's kept very quiet. And the film is in black and white, and there's like a almost 10-minute sequence where everything stops. There's no plot, there's no talking, nothing's going on. It's just a fashion show, and it's in color, and it's these sumptuous evening gowns and tennis wear and stuff to wear sailing and yachting and on vacation, which, who is going on vacation? It's the Depression. And it's just this fantasy of what your life could be like if you were rich and pretty and well married. And I think the movies also really, and the idea of makeup really starts to feed into this consumer porn idea of, like, you will catch a rich husband, you will be socially prominent, you will know what to wear for polo matches if you wear these lipsticks. And then lipsticks are named in such a way that they speak to, like, exotic travel. There's taboo and tattoo, and all of these brands, like sub-dub lipsticks, which means you're not quite a debutante yet, you haven't made your debut in society. So they speak to ambition, and they speak to this fantasy of wealth that Americans are always just they feel that they're always just steps away from. and that for women, beauty is going to help you strike it rich. So the industry very much adapts to that in the Depression. During World War II, it's fascinating. That was one of the first chapters I wrote, actually. It becomes part of the war effort, and it becomes part of distinguishing ourselves from the Axis powers. Fascists outlaw makeup. Hitler really hated lipstick. He associated it with Jews, first of all, and he associated it with, just it was unnatural. It was Aryan women were supposed to be clean scrubbed and naturally rosy and beautiful. And all of the fascist powers try and outlaw makeup to varying extents. And America loves itself not just as a global military power, but like we're very in love with our economic, like how much economic choice we have and what a superpower we are as an economy. And because it adapted to wartime shortage, but we were still churning out lipsticks, and the lipsticks become part of one, you're not some stinky old Nazi because you can wear as much makeup as you want and be glamorous. Two, with the boys away, it is important not to slack on beauty, to think like, it's all sweatpants and and ponytails from here on in. You still got to get yourself up. And it becomes this part of this patriotic act, even though you're now working in a factory, which women had always worked in factories, but not in this capacity. They're like working on the assembly line rather than things like sewing. So it becomes this point of pride with us that we have Jeep red lipsticks, we have auxiliary corps with like every branch of the military, and they all have lipstick. You can buy lipstick at the canteen. And we are not slacking, and we are going to, outgun them and outman them and, look better than the Nazis doing it. So we were fighting fascism, and the copy, as a copywriter, like I'm lucky if I get 2 sentences in an ad, and there are just these entire stories within the ads, like you're winning the war with buying war bonds and wearing lipstick and staying pretty, like you're keeping the home fires burning. And it's this amazing form of propaganda. And people are turning in metal cases for recycling so we can make bullets and bombs and tanks, and so on and so on. And it's just kind of this amazing part of the war effort that you're continuing to wear lipstick and look good is somehow helping the boys over in the trenches, fighting the Battle of the Bulge.
It's almost this triumph of marketing, really, of just adaptation to suit any situation, really. It's incredibly fascinating how that was able to be spun to become a duty, as much as a desire and a need, for professional life.
Yeah, it's kind of insane when you look on it, but like if no one told you, like, you could fight the war on terror if you just did more lip gloss. But it made sense at the time, and it was the industry keeping itself alive, and it's almost this wishful thinking, like I don't know how much good like turning in nylons was doing, but it made people feel a part of the whole. So it is a very useful exercise in that sense.
Yeah. And there's a fascinating turn after the war as well. There's a turn that you use in your book, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And you mentioned that it's putting women back on the pedestal. what was this placing women back on the pedestal? And
Yeah,
what was it? What was happening?
You see, and it was, that's a really interesting adjustment for women, because suddenly, like, they were making a paycheck and they're like, oh, it can work, and they're, they had spent the last 15, 20 years some women working because of the Depression, and then some women joining that force on top of that because of World War II. And so women were largely outside the home, and they were handling things, and they were, I had a professor who used to say women don't have it all, they just do it all. And, we were doing it all. And then all of a sudden the boys come home and it's time to step back into the kitchen. And I think that was a tough adjustment for a lot of women. But again, the industry adapts to that too. And I think there's this sort of, it becomes part of the Cold War, because the culture converts to this, this post World War II, this nuclear world, and this, the expansion of the Soviet bloc, by just saying, like, we can fight this too if you just stay feminine, enough. And one of the interesting things I found in women's magazines of the era is a couple people did go to Russia to on tourism visits, either as chess champions or as exchange students. And the first question they ask them is, do they have lipstick there? And not like, wow, that's an amazing that you're a chess champion, or what did you learn? But they don't really. The Soviets take the opposite tack, which is like, it's American decadence, you don't need it. So it moves from actual World War II to the Cold War, and is redeployed as like this way of being a family, and being a mommy, and being feminine, and a teenage girl. You are fighting communism. You are fighting the Red Menace is actually, the title comes from one of our the way we talk about communism, that it's this creeping, if you just turn your back, it'll creep up under the bed, and it'll be there, it'll be in your house like termites. And it's just everywhere, it's around every corner, it's hiding in every closet, it's check the toilet twice, because there are communists everywhere. And again, lipstick becomes this like triumph of consumerism, this triumph of capitalism over communism. And it could always be worse. You could always be in Russia, where they don't even have lipstick, they just have some weird kind of like Vaseline with mink fat in it. And it is so it's a little bizarre, and I'm sure I'll say that in 20 years about whatever we're talking about now, but it's such a part of the culture that it becomes this insane, Berlin Wall against Americans wanting socialized healthcare or something. But like, you don't need that. You have matching nail polish and lipstick. You live in the best of all.
It's fascinating as well how it's gone from, you're doing this to defeat the Nazis and to win the World War, and then you're doing this to defeat the Russians and defeat communism and to win the Cold War. And it's such a journey, but still a very similar message there, which is fascinating. But during the Cold War, you have periods of liberalization, increased consumerism, and capitalism, as you mentioned, and the rise of popular culture. What happens to lipstick, and how does it adapt to these rise of more liberal attitudes and pop culture?
It's interesting too, because obviously we didn't invent the teenager in the 1950s. They've kind of always been around, but like, the idea of the young person really, Madison Avenue as just sort of a stand-in for all advertising. really discovers that young people, like this baby boom generation, this post-war young person's generation, has disposable income. And so it becomes, we sort of come to prey on their fears, like, do you have pimples? Are you unpopular? Is your breath bad? Do you stink? Like all of these things. And it becomes part and parcel of selling them Elvis albums and, rock and roll, and like this huge rise of youth culture, which we then export to the rest of the world. And so, America gets very good at this period of exporting youth culture and exporting, like Elvis was a huge commodity, just rock and roll. And I love, I'm a huge rockabilly fan, so I actually kind of love what other countries do with that. You see it in the Teddy Boy culture and in the UK, and the Japanese have their own interpretation, and all over the world. But we start to export stuff like rock and roll, and lipstick comes along with that as part of youth culture. Moving into the 60s, we get the British invasion, it starts to move the other way, and we start to get imported brands as Mary Quant and Yardley, and those become the hot brands, because for once we are importing for the first time in a couple hundred years, we're like starting to import culture rather than export it. But it is a huge part of American consumerism, is something we have, again, like we will come stomping in with Coca-Cola and McDonald's wherever you are. And it's a big thing about creating, we exist to create new markets. Like, so there were jokes about people going to the moon with silk stockings and Hershey bars. So it's a big thing. And it's interesting, like, the industry then has to adapt again as the 60s come on, and the youth culture starts to reject being advertised to. They start to reject lipstick and just general, you get the hippie culture, and they're like, we don't want to be advertised to, man. They do, just in another way. And so the industry really struggles to adapt to this new, freer, more, more self-determined and generation. And it's interesting because I think there's an interesting flip again in the 70s in what I always describe as the industry learning to speak feminism. And it starts largely in 1973 with L'Oreal's Because I'm Worth It campaign, or because we're worth it, because you're worth it. That will change over the years. But it's this idea like, oh, what if we took the 60s messaging of rejecting the norm of makeup, and we make it empowering. We make it, we make your makeup, your lipstick, be a feminist statement of who you are. So lipstick gets to be entirely more personal. It's less about just chasing the trends and more about telling the world who you are. It's more lifestyle-y. It's more, I decide how sexy I am. I decide how I present myself to the world. And again, women in the workforce now, because they want to be, because they are putting off marriage and they are putting off children, and the sexual revolution, and it becomes part and parcel of that. It also becomes part of the 70s chapter was actually, I never think of it as a high style period for Americans and for American fashion. But then I went back and I looked at it, and I actually found it was one of the most fascinating chapters to me, because it contains Stonewall. So just breaking the gender norm starts to become a thing, because one of the fights that Stonewall was over was the cops could arrest you if you were wearing something of the opposite sex. And we are still fighting that today in Florida and a bunch of other states, where we're for some reason cracking down on drag queen and trans people for no reason. But a lot of the Stonewall uprising and the gay liberation that comes with it is about it's about breaking those gender norms for some people, and or the choice to not wear lipstick, the choice to not opt into like all of the trappings that we have told women that they need. And also it becomes punk rock, it becomes subversive, and like that it becomes part of rock and roll. And you see glam rock and Bowie and the New York Dolls, and later in the 80s you'll see Adam Ant and Boy George and all the hair metal bands. But to me, the 70s was actually a lot more interesting than I thought it was going to be, makeup beauty wise, because it became about either the industry subverting it itself in a saleable way by making lipstick speak to feminism, and it became very subversive with both Stonewall and just rock and roll in general, about starting to see like the origins of punk and new wave and heavy metal, or hair metal, not really heavy metal. Don't come after me. In all of that. And so it's the industry will flip according to what is going on in the zeitgeist. Whatever the political culture is, the industry will find a way to get along, because
I mean, that really seems like the prevailing theme throughout your book and through the lipstick industry and cosmetic industry, is that they're able to really quite cleverly latch on to social movements, political movements, and cultural movements to really capitalize off that moment. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not I mean, it sounds entirely mercenary. It's not. I mean, they are people they are people who are living in this world too. And you're seeing, certainly in the current era, more female entrepreneurs, more non-binary, more gender non-conforming. So they're people, who want to see, companies want to see themselves reflected in this world. Some people do not. I mean, there's always, Charles Revson, who ran Revlon, was kind of like an unashamed jerk. Like, he really was such a jerk. Didn't get the whole women's lib thing. But so some of it is sincere. It is companies are made up of people who live in the same world you do. Some of it is very mercenary, like what our marketing says, diversity is big now, so we should get in on that. But it is the industry's ability to adapt, and what we tell women they want is very interesting. And the industry has always been very clever about speaking to, it ranges from like, you want to catch a husband, you want to look young, to much more subtle messages and much more interesting messages. And the industry, I think, now it's always changing, it's always adapting. The way people consume information is different. The way every generation consumes advertising is different. Like, I'm very Gen X. I thought I was punk rock, and like, we very much felt like we're too smart for this. We don't want your labels. Yes and no, but or we just went out and found different brands that sort of spoke to us, or tried. But it's a very adaptive industry, almost more so than anything else. I mean, the car industry has to move slower. The movie industry is very slow. Makeup is very adaptive for what's going on. They can change pretty quick.
And I you've seen that throughout your book, really, and I think it's a fascinating read that you can track those changes as you go along, reading through chapter by chapter. And one of the final pieces of adaptation you speak about in your book is the rise of the internet, and how the internet revolutionizes the industry. Would you mind talking to us about that and the role of the internet in the industry today?
Yeah, I think one of the good things and the bad things about the internet is that everybody's an expert. Everybody's an expert on everything. And that's especially true in beauty. And, in the 90s, for example, there were all these brands that were built around makeup artists, and they were the experts. And there was like NARS and Lorac and Kevin Aucoin, and all of them based around the idea like these guys are, PhD in lipstick, and they know everything about it. So that was the following, and it was easy to entrust them with your money. Now there are a lot of influencers, and some of them are makeup artists, and some of them are just people sitting at home in front of their mirrors who've just gotten really good at doing their makeup. And there's nothing not legitimate about that, but they have taken a certain amount of power away from either the company telling you like, this season we're all about berries, that's the look, or just the idea like, this is the guy, this is Max Factor is going to tell you what to wear this season. So there's a certain democratization in that, and there's a certain like and then companies have to scramble around to meet what they go to where the influencers are, which has had mixed results. And then there's a very weird amount of trust that, to me, because again, Gen X, that we put in celebrity, like again, like Kylie Jenner ended up with her own $1 jillion line of lip kits, and I'm not entirely sure what her background of expertise was, other than being like a famous pretty person. So people are really also a little willing just to divorce from that need for like a pedigree of expertise. And there is just a fast fashion element to it. Like people are willing to turn over very quickly. Like, this season, the red is, you can say like, oh, it's a little darker or it's more orange, or, and, it's sheer, it's a matte, whatever it is. People just change over much more quickly. And I think you also see that in things like Sephora, like they've taken away that layer of woman, who usually it was a woman, at the counter, and which is chopping away another layer of expertise. Another weird side effect is just like magazines, like in the US, Allure was a huge magazine for the longest time, and they were, sort of one of the papers of record. Print is folding up just because people consume information differently. So I think they still want that one magic bullet, like go to influencers, that's guaranteed sales. It's not. And especially if an influencer goes south or crazy, or the line doesn't work out. Go to celebrities, everybody and their dog has a line of lipsticks now. So so it's just the internet has just made stuff so diffuse and so segmented. There are, and wonderfully so, there are entire lines that are just sort of appeal to the non-binary. And their entire lines, they're like, their main messaging is cruelty-free. We use the word clean a lot. It does or does not mean anything. so people are, it's, the industry is so segmented, and the internet has allowed people to just find something, find that really teeny tiny sliver that's theirs, or that's theirs for today. Like, I need clean, animal cruelty free glitter. And you're just a couple of Google searches away from that. Then I need all the reviews on it. So just the way people consume is much different. And the industry, this is just trying to find a way to keep up with that is, it's toppled. Like Revlon declared bankruptcy this year, and they were a major player since the Depression. So it's a very complicated world now, beauty wise, and there is no one overarching message. So it's really about, everyone trying to find their diverse, clean, vegan, uh, old or young niche in there. And maybe you're going for everybody over 40, and maybe you're going for everybody over 60, or maybe you're going for tweens. It is so hard to be all things to all people anymore, in a way that it wasn't when it was just pretty much just the mass market of L'Oreal and Maybelline and CoverGirl, and then there was like the high end of Chanel. Like, the world is yours now, at every price point. So it's the internet has made things very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from where I've observed things, I've seen whole influencer lines emerge, gain massive popularity, and then a year later they're just gone. And it's an incredibly fascinating industry to watch from afar without being involved in it too much.
Yeah, and people are like, they're very attracted to like personalities, and they're weird. Everybody and their dog has licensing now. So there's just like Muppet makeup, like somebody had a Miss Piggy line. So I grew up on the Muppets. I love them. So I went over and I looked at it, and I was like, I don't necessarily want to look like Miss Piggy, it just, why would I pick that as a beauty thing? Or like Baby Yoda, and Baby Yoda's great. I love him. But would I, as an adult professional lady, pick that as my look? I don't know, but it's kind of awesome. Somebody did. I'm sure somebody's looking great in it. So you get these weird licensing deals. Somebody sent me a press release not in the last couple of years for a cup of noodles, the like ramen cup of noodles, pour in boiling water. And I'm like, I don't even think of those as a particularly, like, what's even colored in there? It's like just beige. And but no, they got a whole themed makeup line. So some of them make sense, or some of them are just not for me. But yeah, and also, like, I think the other explosion that we've had is just the explosion of drag and Drag Race being mainstreamed, and it's that is a thing. Like, contouring used to not be a thing for women, because it was just it was it was it was either very subtle, and it was designed by drag queens to feminize the face. And then all of a sudden you see people, and they are actual female women, like, contoured within an inch of their lives. And it's like, but your face is already shaped like that. You don't need to create the illusion of your face being shaped like that. It's very strange. But it's a whole lot of factors. And yeah, the internet has just kicked open every door, created a lot of weird makeup celebrities, some I like. There's one, Bailey Sarian, that I was watching during the one, when I was writing this book, and two, it was just the pandemic, and she would put on her makeup, and her makeup always looked really neat. and she would tell you the story of some serial killer. So it combined like true crime plus some really cool eyeshadow looks. And I thought that was very clever because those were two things people were really into it and in the moment. She's a big influencer, and she found her niche.
I mean, it's all about finding that, isn't it? It's all about finding that and attacking that.
Yeah. So it's just, yeah, what else is out there? I don't know.
Now, I wanted to ask you a final fun question, as we do for all our guests here on the History of Jackson podcast. Now, something I found particularly interesting in each of your chapters was that you mentioned a shade of the decade. Now, I don't think it's going to be Martha Washington's, but I would like to ask you, what was your favourite shade that you came across whilst researching?
Oh, God. There's one that's just called Ashes of Roses, and I think that appeals to my inner goth child. I think it's Bourgeois. But oh God, but also going back to the 90s, I remember some of those from like high school, college, where I was just like, oh, that was a terrible shade, but it was so big because I change all the time. But I bought one recently that I was like, I'm gonna say that's my favorite color. And it's from NARS, and it's Dracula. It's talk about licensing. I love Universal Monsters, and it's Bela Lugosi. It's called Dracula, and I love it. So, it's not from
all great names.
Yeah. So it's not from NARS. Now they're not going to send me free lipstick. Damn it. It's from Smashbox. I'm sorry. Smashbox Dracula is my current favorite.
I think when I was going through, I was thinking they're just all fantastic names. And I think whoever's naming them, they deserve.
I've got to name some eyeshadows. I've always wanted to name lipsticks. It's actually, as a copywriter, one of my favorite assignments is doing namings. Just because you kind of want to get it in the area of the color, but I think people have given up on that, and people are like, it's called Whisper, or it's called Montauk, or it's, like it just doesn't have anything. No clue what the color is, but it sounds like dreamy and aspirational and like vacationy or something like that. And so I if anybody out there needs color naming, get in touch, because I will do it, because it's such a there's some great names out there. Like Revlon Cherries in the Snow was like a classic red for years.
I mean, I've always been fascinated whenever I walk through the aisles, just looking at the names. It's always I've always found it very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, if our listeners want,
he was doing that.
Yeah. Now, if our listeners are going to want to go away, and of course they are after this amazing conversation, they're going to want to go away and learn more about the history of lipstick and cosmetics. Where can they go, and what can they read and listen to?
My website is lipstickbook.com, so you can start there. Gabriela Hernandez, who actually owns Besame Cosmetics, wrote a great book on the history of cosmetics. It's interesting because there were things around it that I find great. If you want to learn more on Western stuff, a friend of mine just wrote a book which I think is interesting and sort of parallels some of my own research on the way we think about the West versus the American Wild West versus the way it actually was. And it's her book, I think, is just called Western Wear. She's Sonia Abrego, Abrego, Dr. Sonia Abrego. And similarly, my friend wrote that book on leopard print, which is called Fierce, The History of Leopard Print by Joe Weldon, Joweldon. And they're not exactly makeup books, but they're interesting because they deal in some of the same construction around how we advertise to women and fashion history, and how we have, fashion and beauty mythology, and then we have its actual history, and those are not the same thing. But we kind of like them both. So those are some of my my recommendations in the field, but if not necessarily on top of the same thing. And also, there's a great book on beauty history called Hope in a Jar by Kathy Peiss, Peiss. And that's on the history of like the beauty industry in America. That was a great book.
They all sound like brilliant reads to increase knowledge around the subject.
Yeah.
And today we've heard just a facet, just a very small slither of the amazing stories and histories that you have, spoken about and written about within your book, The Red Menace. So where can our listeners grab a copy of your book?
It's for sale in the UK. And I know somebody bought it in Australia. We'll start at lipstickbook.com and I will find the link for international. It's on Amazon. I try not to throw to them. But you can always ask your bookseller for it and they will get it for you.
Well, I'll make sure a link for your website and a link to buy your book is in the description below for our listeners. So hopefully they can go and grab themselves a copy. Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I've had a really great conversation with you.
Thank you so much.